welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Turn off your lights and listen closely. Tonight, I have 7 stories that will make your blood run cold. These aren't made up. They're real events from people who worked in the loneliest corners of the Appalachian Mountains, where help is hours away and strange things hide in the shadows. A night shift worker feeding creatures from underground, a mail carrier who got replaced by something wearing her face, a mechanic whose daughter almost got turned into a machine. These people lived through absolute nightmares. Before we start, hit subscribe and drop a like if you're brave enough. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, but keep your doors locked tonight. Ready? Let's dive into the darkness. Trust me, after these stories, you'll never feel safe in a small town again. I'm 19 years old, and honestly, I never thought I'd be telling anyone this story. My name's Jake, and I work the overnight shift at Mountain View Grocery in Ravens Creek, West Virginia. It's one of those small mountain towns where everybody knows everybody, and the biggest excitement is usually when the high school football team makes it past the first round of playoffs. I moved here about 8 months ago after my mom remarried and her new husband got a job at the coal processing plant. I wasn't thrilled about leaving my friends back in Charleston, but the cost of living is cheaper here, and I needed work that didn't require a college degree I couldn't afford. The grocery store job isn't glamorous, but it pays decent for around here, $13 an hour to stock shelves from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Most nights, it's just me and the hum of the freezers, which honestly, I preferred to dealing with customers during the day shift. I'd always been a night owl anyway, so the schedule worked out fine. My manager, Carol, is this sweet older lady who's worked at the store for like 30 years. She told me the overnight position had been hard to fill because a lot of people don't like being alone in a big building all night. But I figured it was perfect. No drama, no rushing around, just me, my earbuds, and endless rows of cereal boxes and canned goods. The store itself is pretty typical for a small town. Not huge like a Walmart, but big enough to have a pharmacy, a decent meat department, and all the basics people need. It was built back in the 1980s when the town was doing better economically, so it's got that older layout with wide aisles and those industrial tile floors that echo when you walk. During my shift, I'd work my way systematically through each aisle, checking inventory, rotating stock, and putting out the new shipments that came in during the evening. The routine was actually kind of meditative. Scan the shelves, move products around, listen to podcasts or music, and watch the hours tick by until Carol showed up at 7 a.m. with coffee and whatever gossip she'd picked up at the diner. For the first 6 months, nothing unusual ever happened. I'd see the occasional deer through the windows, or sometimes teenagers would drive by and honk their horns, but that was about it. The most exciting thing was when the power went out during a storm one night, and I had to use my phone's flashlight to finish stocking until the generators kicked in. I'd gotten comfortable with the solitude, even started looking forward to it. There's something peaceful about having an entire store to yourself, knowing you're the only person awake in the building while the rest of the town sleeps. But 3 days ago, everything changed, and now I'm honestly not sure I can keep doing this job. I've always been pretty level-headed. I don't believe in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. My mom used to tell me that mountain towns are full of superstitious people who blame everything on spirits or curses, and I figured she was probably right. But what I've been experiencing lately has me questioning everything I thought I knew about what's possible and what isn't. It started on Tuesday night, around 2 a.m. I was working in aisle 7, stocking soup cans, when I heard this scratching sound coming from somewhere underneath me. At first, I figured it was just mice or rats. Old buildings always have rodent problems, especially when there's food around. I'd mentioned seeing mouse droppings to Carol a few weeks back, and she said they had an exterminator come by every few months to keep things under control. But this scratching was different somehow. It was too loud to be mice, and it seemed to follow a specific pattern. 3 quick scrapes, then a pause, then 3 slower scrapes, then repeat. I stopped what I was doing and listened more carefully, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be moving along underneath the floor, following the length of the aisle. When I walked toward the front of the store, the scratching moved in the same direction, staying directly beneath my feet. When I stopped, it stopped. When I backed up, it followed me backward. It was like something was tracking my movements from below the concrete foundation. By Wednesday night, the scratching had gotten louder and more persistent. It wasn't just in aisle 7 anymore. I could hear it throughout the entire store, moving from section to section as I worked. The pattern never changed. 3 quick, 3 slow, pause, repeat. I tried stomping on the floor a few times to see if I could scare away whatever was down there, but it didn't seem to have any effect. If anything, the scratching seemed to get more excited when I made noise, like whatever was causing it was responding to my presence. I mentioned it to Carol when she came in Wednesday morning, trying to sound casual about it. I told her we might have a bigger rodent problem than she realized, maybe rats or even something larger like possums that had gotten into the building's foundation. She looked concerned and said she'd call the exterminator to come take a look. But she also mentioned that the day shift employees had never reported hearing anything unusual. That struck me as odd. If there were animals large enough to make that much noise, you'd think someone would have noticed during busy hours when the store was full of customers and staff. Thursday night was when things got really weird. I was working in the dairy section around 1:30 a.m. when the scratching started up again, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a low humming sound, almost like someone singing underground. The humming was rhythmic and melodic, but I couldn't make out any words or recognize the tune. It seemed to be coming from the same place as the scratching, somewhere deep beneath the floor. The combination of sounds was genuinely unsettling in a way I can't fully explain. The scratching was mechanical and repetitive, but the humming was clearly being produced by something intelligent, something that understood melody and rhythm. I found myself standing perfectly still in the middle of the dairy aisle, listening to this underground concert and feeling my skin crawl. Whatever was down there wasn't just an animal looking for food. It was something that could think, something that could make music. That's when I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I grabbed my phone and started walking around the store, trying to find where the sounds were loudest. They seemed to be strongest near the back of the building, particularly around the meat department. I'd never paid much attention to that area during my shifts, since the butchers handled all the meat prep during day hours. But now I was examining every inch of the floor, looking for any signs of disturbance. Behind the main meat counter, partially hidden by some storage racks, I found something that made my blood run cold. A perfectly round hole in the concrete floor, about 3 feet in diameter. The edges were smooth and precise, like it had been cut by professional equipment, but there was no construction dust or debris around it. The hole looked old, like it had been there for years, but I was certain it hadn't been there the previous week. I would have noticed something that obvious during my regular cleaning routine. I knelt down beside the hole and shined my phone's flashlight into it, trying to see how deep it went. The light beam disappeared into complete darkness. I couldn't see the bottom at all. On impulse, I picked up my heavy-duty flashlight from my supply cart and dropped it down the hole, listening for the sound of impact. I counted the seconds. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, all the way up to 10 before I finally heard a distant crash as the flashlight hit something solid far below. The humming was definitely coming from inside the hole, echoing up from the depths like it was being produced in some kind of underground chamber. But there was something else too, a smell rising up from the darkness that reminded me of old copper pennies mixed with something organic and rotten. It wasn't overpowering, but it was distinctive enough to make me unconsciously hold my breath and lean back from the opening. As I crouched there, shining my phone light into the hole and trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I noticed that the walls going down weren't just smooth concrete. There were markings carved into the stone, symbols and patterns that looked ancient and deliberate. I could make out spirals, triangular shapes, and what looked like crude stick figures arranged in rows. The symbols seemed to shift and move in the flickering light from my phone, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. That's when I saw the eyes. Two pale, reflective points of light appeared in the darkness below, staring back up at me like a cat's eyes caught in headlights. But these weren't animal eyes. They were too large, too far apart, and they had an intelligence behind them that made my stomach drop. As I watched, frozen in place, the eyes moved closer to the bottom of the hole, and I could make out the vague outline of a face that was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Then it spoke. "Night worker comes to visit the old ones below," the voice said, clear as day but with an accent I couldn't place. Not quite southern, not quite anything else I'd ever heard. The words echoed up from the hole with perfect English pronunciation, but there was something off about the rhythm and inflection, like someone who had learned the language by listening rather than speaking. I scrambled backward so fast I knocked over a display of processed meats, sending packages of lunch meat scattering across the floor. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I sat there on the cold tile floor, staring at the hole, waiting to see if anything else would happen. The scratching sounds started up again, but now they were coming from multiple directions. As I listened in growing horror, I realized there weren't just scratching sounds coming from that one hole. There were similar sounds coming from other parts of the store. I could hear them near the pharmacy, by the dairy coolers, and in the produce section. Whatever was down there wasn't confined to one small area. They were everywhere, underneath the entire building. More holes had appeared. I don't know how I hadn't noticed them before. Maybe I hadn't been looking, or maybe they hadn't been there during my previous shifts. But now, as I walked through the store with new awareness, I could see perfectly round openings in the floor scattered throughout the building. Each hole was exactly the same size and depth as the first one, with the same smooth edges and the same carved symbols visible along the walls going down. The voices were coming from all of them now. "Surface dweller brings light to dark places," they chanted in unison, the same strange accent and rhythm coming from each hole. It was like a choir of underground dwellers, all speaking the same words at the same time. The harmony was unsettling, too coordinated to be coincidental, but with subtle variations that suggested individual personalities behind each voice. I was standing in the middle of the main aisle, turning in a slow circle and counting holes, when something started climbing up from the opening behind the meat department. I heard the scraping of claws against stone, the sound of something large and heavy pulling itself upward through the narrow space. Whatever was down there was coming to the surface. The first thing that emerged was a hand, if you could call it that. It was pale white, the color of old bone, with fingers that were too long and jointed in too many places. The skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and I could see dark veins running underneath like shadows. As I watched in frozen horror, The creature used its impossible hand to grip the edge of the hole and haul the rest of itself up onto the store floor. What came out of that hole defied everything I thought I knew about anatomy and physics. The creature was humanoid in the sense that it had 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, but all the proportions were wrong. It must have been 8 feet tall when it finally stood upright, with arms that hung down past its knees and a torso that seemed stretched like taffy. Its skin was the same bone-white color as its hands, covered with what looked like centuries of accumulated dirt and grime. When it turned its head to look at me, I saw that its neck was longer than any human neck should be, allowing its head to tilt at angles that would break a normal spine. Its eyes were completely black, not dark brown or dark blue, but true black, like looking into empty sockets. And when it smiled at me, I saw rows of teeth that looked like broken glass, jagged and sharp and far too many for any normal mouth. More creatures were emerging from the other holes now, pulling themselves up through the openings with that same deliberate, careful movement. They were all similar in appearance, pale, stretched, wrong, but each one was slightly different, like variations on the same impossible theme. Some were taller, some had longer arms, some had more pronounced joints or different arrangements of those glass shard teeth. They moved through the store with curious, almost childlike interest, examining everything they encountered. One picked up a can of tomato soup from my abandoned cart and turned it over in its elongated fingers, studying the label like it contained profound secrets. Another stood in front of the frozen foods section, watching the condensation form on the glass doors with what appeared to be genuine fascination. They were learning about surface life by examining our food and technology. The first creature, the one that had climbed up behind the meat department, approached me with slow, measured steps. Its movements were deliberate and non-threatening, but there was an alien quality to the way it carried itself that made my skin crawl. When it was close enough that I could smell the earthy mineral scent that clung to its skin, it spoke again. "You bring sustenance from above ground," it said, tilting its head at that impossible angle and studying me with those black, empty eyes. "Night worker makes offerings to old ones below." I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that they thought I was intentionally delivering food to them. They believed that my job stocking shelves was some kind of ritual offering, that the grocery store existed specifically to provide sustenance to whatever ancient civilization lived beneath the building. They'd been living down there for who knows how long, surviving on whatever scraps fell through cracks or got left behind. And now they wanted to establish some kind of formal trade relationship. "We guard mountain territory for many seasons," the creature continued, its voice echoing strangely in the empty store. "Surface dwellers build feeding place above old home. We accept trade arrangement, regular sustenance for continued protection services." Another creature, this one with arms so long they dragged on the floor when it walked, joined the conversation. "Deep dwellers grow restless without proper feeding schedule. We keep deeper ones sleeping with regular offerings. Surface dwellers need protection from what lives in deepest places." I didn't like the sound of that. These pale, stretched creatures were apparently the good guys in this situation, standing guard against something even worse that lived further underground. When I asked what they meant by deeper ones, all the creatures went silent and pointed toward the original hole behind the meat department. As I listened, I could hear something massive moving far below, something that made the floor vibrate slightly and caused the pale creatures to exchange nervous glances. "Deep dwellers have been sleeping for 47 seasons," the first creature explained. "They wake when offerings stop coming. Mountain communities exist because we maintain feeding arrangements and keep deeper ones satisfied with regular deliveries. They gave me a list of foods they needed, mostly meat and dairy products, some canned goods, and specific types of produce. The list was written on what looked like tree bark, using symbols similar to the ones carved into the walls of the holes. They warned me that deliveries had to happen every night at exactly 3 a.m., and that missing even a single delivery would have unfortunate consequences for all surface dwellers in territorial range. I didn't ask what those consequences might be. I didn't want to know. So here I am, 3 days later, continuing to work my overnight shift, but with a completely different understanding of what my job actually entails. Every night at 3 a.m., I gather the requested items from the store inventory and lower them down the holes in canvas bags. I've learned to avoid looking too far down into the darkness. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement that suggests the pale creatures are just the surface level of a much larger underground population. The deeper ones are still down there. Sometimes late at night, when the store is particularly quiet, I can hear them stirring far below the foundation. It sounds like massive machinery starting up, or like huge animals rolling over in their sleep. The pale creatures get nervous when those sounds start, moving more quickly and speaking in hushed tones about maintaining proper feeding, schedules, and keeping the peace. Carol still doesn't know about any of this. As far as she's concerned, I'm just a reliable overnight employee who's been doing good work keeping the inventory organized. The missing food gets written off as shoplifting or inventory discrepancies. Nothing unusual for a small-town grocery store. I've thought about telling her or telling someone else, but who would believe me? And honestly, I'm not sure I want to be responsible for disrupting whatever ancient arrangement keeps this mountain community safe from the things that live in the deepest places underground. I still work the midnight shift at Mountain View Grocery. I still stock shelves and organize inventory and count down the hours until morning. But now I know that my real job is maintaining a feeding schedule for an underground civilization that's been protecting these mountains for longer than recorded history. Every night at 3 a.m., I make my deliveries to the holes, and every morning I go home knowing that something much worse than pale, stretched creatures is sleeping peacefully in the depths below. Looking back now, I understand why the overnight position had been so hard to fill. I wasn't the first person to discover the holes and make contact with the underground dwellers. I probably won't be the last. But as long as the deliveries keep happening on schedule, the mountain communities stay safe, and the deeper ones stay asleep. That's a responsibility I'm not ready to walk away from, even if it means spending the rest of my nights making offerings to things that shouldn't exist, in service of keeping much worse things from waking up and remembering that there's a world full of surface dwellers living just above their heads. To this day, I still hear the scratching sounds when I'm trying to fall asleep during the day. 3 quick scrapes, pause, 3 slow scrapes, repeat. Sometimes I think they're trying to remind me that they're always down there, always listening, always counting on me to maintain the arrangement that keeps everyone safe. I never miss a delivery. I'm 28 years old, and I run a small daycare called Little Sprouts here in Cedar Ridge, North Carolina. Been doing it for about 3 years now, ever since I moved back home after college. It's not glamorous work, but I love those kids, and honestly, it pays the bills while letting me stay close to family. My parents still live about 20 minutes up the mountain road, and my great-grandmother's old property sits right between us. About 20 acres of woods and meadow that's been in our family since the 1800s. I'd always thought it would make a perfect spot for outdoor activities with the daycare kids, you know? Fresh mountain air, plenty of space to run around, and far enough from town that parents wouldn't worry about traffic or strangers. That's why I planned the camping trip for 12 of my regular kids last month. Their parents were excited about it. Most of these families work long hours at the textile plant or the lumber yard, so a weekend where their kids could experience real nature instead of just the small playground behind my house seemed like a gift. I'd been talking about it for months, getting all the permission slips signed, buying proper camping gear with my own money because I wanted everything to be perfect. The kids were between 5 and 7 years old, just the right age to be curious about everything, but still young enough to listen when I told them to stay close. Looking back now, I wish I'd never suggested that trip. I wish I'd just stuck to our usual routine of arts and crafts and story time. But I thought I was giving those children something special, something they'd remember their whole lives. And I guess in a way, I did. The property has always felt peaceful to me. When I was little, I'd spend summers up there with my great-grandmother before she passed, helping her tend the small garden she kept near the old family cemetery. She'd tell me stories about our ancestors, especially about the 6 children who died during the diphtheria outbreak of 1892. Their graves are still there, small weathered stones with names like Emma Grace, Joshua, Katie May, Michael, Sarah Beth, and little Thomas, all between the ages of 5 and 8 when they passed. Great-grandmother always said they were buried together because they'd been playmates in life, and it seemed fitting they'd rest together too. I'd brought the daycare kids up there a few times for day trips, and they loved exploring the woods and picking wildflowers. Emma, Josh, Katie, Michael, Sarah, and Tommy from my current group had become especially attached to the place. These 6 always seemed to gravitate toward each other anyway. They'd been coming to my daycare since they were toddlers, and their parents were all friends who worked at the same places around town. When I mentioned the camping trip, they were the first to sign up, and they spent weeks talking about sleeping in real tents and roasting marshmallows over a campfire. The other 6 kids were excited too, but these particular children seemed almost obsessed with the idea. They'd draw pictures of the camping trip during art time, always featuring the same elements: tents, a campfire, and strangely, always 6 additional stick figures that they couldn't explain when I asked about them. "Just some other kids," Emma would say with a shrug, and the others would nod in agreement. I figured it was just their imagination running wild. Kids that age always invent imaginary friends and elaborate fantasy scenarios. It seemed perfectly normal, even sweet. We set up camp on a Friday afternoon in early October, when the leaves were just starting to turn and the weather was still warm enough for outdoor sleeping, but cool enough that we'd need the campfire at night. I'd chosen a flat meadow area about a quarter-mile from the old cemetery, close enough to the family history that made the land special, but far enough away to feel respectful of the graves. The kids helped me pitch the tents. I had 3 large family-sized ones that could fit 4 children each, plus my own smaller tent where I planned to sleep. But as we were setting up, Emma pointed toward the tree line and asked about that tent over there. When I looked, I saw an old canvas tent partially hidden in the shadows between the trees. It looked like something hunters might have left behind, probably decades old based on the faded color and primitive design. I made a mental note to check it out later and dispose of it properly, but the kids were immediately fascinated by it. "Can we sleep in the old tent tonight?" Josh asked, and soon all 6 of them, Emma, Josh, Katie, Michael, Sarah, and Tommy, were pleading to use it instead of the new tents I'd brought. I tried to explain that we didn't know how long it had been there or if it was safe, but they kept insisting. Finally, I agreed to inspect it after dinner to see if it was structurally sound enough for them to use. The rest of Friday evening went perfectly. We roasted hot dogs over the campfire, made s'mores, and I told them stories about our family's history on the land. The kids were particularly interested in hearing about the 6 children who died in 1892, asking detailed questions about what their lives had been like and whether they'd enjoyed playing in these same woods. As the sun set, we walked up to the cemetery so each child could place a wildflower on one of the small graves. That's when things started feeling wrong, though I didn't recognize it at the time. As we stood among the weathered headstones, Emma suddenly grabbed my arm and whispered, "Miss Amanda, do you hear that?" I listened carefully, and beneath the normal evening sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, I could swear I heard something else. Faint voices, almost like children singing a lullaby or hymn. It seemed to be coming from underground, from the graves themselves. "It's just the wind," I said. But as soon as the words left my mouth, all 6 kids began humming along with the melody. They hummed in perfect harmony, as if they'd rehearsed this song 100 times, even though I knew for certain none of them had ever heard it before. The other 6 children from my daycare seemed unaffected, chattering normally about which flowers looked prettiest on the graves. When I asked Emma's group how they knew that tune, they all looked confused. "What tune?" Katie asked, even though she'd been humming just seconds before. "We weren't singing anything." That night, I checked the old tent and found it was in surprisingly good condition. The canvas was thick and waterproof, the stakes were solid, and it was actually larger inside than I'd expected. Against my better judgment, I let the 6 kids sleep there together, while the other 6 stayed in the regular tents with me nearby. I figured if anything went wrong, they could easily come back to the main camp. I should have trusted my instincts instead. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of movement outside my tent. When I unzipped the flap to look out, I saw all 6 children from the old tent walking in single file toward the cemetery. They moved with strange, synchronized steps, and they were humming that same melody from earlier. I called out to them, but they didn't respond or even acknowledge that they'd heard me. I followed them up the hill, watching as they arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the 6 small graves. They stood completely motionless, facing inward, humming continuously. The sound seemed to echo from the ground beneath their feet, as if the buried children were humming along from inside their graves. When I approached and asked what they were doing, they all turned toward me in unison, their eyes reflecting the moonlight in an unsettling way. "We're making friends," Tommy said in a voice that sounded older than his 6 years. "They've been waiting so long to play with someone." I managed to convince them to come back to camp, though they moved reluctantly, constantly looking over their shoulders toward the graves. The next morning, they claimed they didn't remember leaving their tent at all. When I described what I'd seen, they seemed genuinely confused and a little scared by their own behavior. Saturday brought new problems. During our planned nature scavenger hunt, I'd hidden clues around the property that would eventually lead the kids to a prize I'd buried near the cemetery. Just some candy and small toys wrapped in waterproof bags. But when we reached the final location, we found something that definitely wasn't part of my scavenger hunt. 6 small graves had been freshly dug beside the old ones. Not deep graves, just shallow depressions in the earth. But they were clearly meant to be graves. And each one had a crude wooden marker with a name carved into it. Emma, Josh, Katie, Michael, Sarah, and Tommy. The dates carved below the names showed this year, this month, this weekend. I felt my blood turn cold. Someone had been on the property, had known we were coming, had known the children's names. My first thought was that this was some sick prank or maybe even a threat. I started to tell the kids we needed to pack up and leave immediately. But when I turned around, the 6 children were standing over their own graves, humming that haunting melody again. "Look," Emma said, pointing into her shallow grave. "They left us presents." Inside each grave was a small wooden toy, hand-carved dolls and animals that looked like they'd been made in the 1800s. The children reached into their graves and picked up the toys, cradling them like treasures. When I tried to take the toys away, explaining that we needed to leave right now, the children resisted with a strength that seemed impossible for their age. "The other children made these for us," Sarah said, her voice carrying that same strange, older quality I'd heard from Tommy the night before. "They've been making them for so long, waiting for us to come play." That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a prank or a threat from living people. Something had been waiting on this land, something connected to those 6 children who died here over a century ago. And somehow, they'd chosen their new playmates. Saturday night, I barely slept. I kept my tent flaps open and watched the old canvas tent where the 6 children insisted on sleeping again. At exactly 3 a.m., just like the night before, they emerged and walked to the cemetery. This time I followed immediately, determined to bring them back to the main camp and pack up first thing in the morning. But when I reached the cemetery, I saw something that made my legs go weak. 12 children stood around the graves, not 6. The 6 from my daycare were there, but beside each of them stood another child. Translucent figures in old-fashioned clothing that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. The ghostly children looked exactly like the names on the headstones suggested: Emma Grace, Joshua, Katie May, Michael, Sarah Beth, and little Thomas. They were holding hands with their living counterparts, all of them swaying gently as they hummed in harmony. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't make a sound. The dead children looked at me with hollow eyes that held decades of loneliness and longing. They'd been waiting here for so long, and they'd finally found friends their own age to play with forever. When the living children turned to look at me, their eyes held the same hollow quality. Emma spoke, but her voice was doubled, her own young voice overlapping with an older, more distant sound. "We're going to stay here and play," she said. "The others have been so lonely, and they've prepared such wonderful games for us." I managed to break through my paralysis and ran forward, grabbing for the children's hands to pull them away. But my hands passed right through them, as if they were becoming ghosts themselves. I could feel them, could sense their presence, but I couldn't touch them physically. They were becoming part of something else, something that belonged to this place and these graves. The ghostly children smiled at me, and their dead eyes held a terrible kindness. They weren't evil, I realized. They were just children who died too young and had been waiting over a century for friends to join them in their eternal games. To them, this was a gift they were offering: everlasting friendship, endless playtime, no more loneliness or fear or sadness. But I wasn't going to let them take these babies. I ran back to camp and started packing frantically, shouting for the other 6 children to get up and help me load everything into my van. I called the parents of the possessed children, telling them there was a family emergency and they needed to pick up their kids immediately. I didn't care how crazy I sounded. I just needed to get those children away from this place before the ghostly bond became permanent. The parents arrived by dawn, confused and worried by my panicked phone calls. Emma, Josh, Katie, Michael, Sarah, and Tommy came down from the cemetery as their families arrived, but they moved in perfect synchronization, and their eyes still held that strange, doubled quality. They didn't run to greet their parents like they normally would. Instead, they stood in a line, staring back toward the graves with expressions of profound loss. That was a week ago. Since then, those 6 children haven't spoken a single word. They sit motionless for hours, staring toward the mountains where my family's property lies. When they do move, they walk in perfectly coordinated steps and hum that haunting funeral melody. Their parents are threatening to sue me, demanding answers I can't give them. How do I explain that their children are sharing their bodies and minds with kids who died in 1892? Yesterday, I found the photos I'd taken during our camping trip, and they confirmed my worst fears. In every single picture, there are 12 children visible, not just the 6 from my daycare. The ghostly children show up clearly in the photographs, standing beside their chosen friends, holding their hands, sharing their space. The living children and dead children are becoming indistinguishable from each other. I've been back to the property once since then, hoping to find some way to break the connection. But when I reached the cemetery, I found that the 6 fresh graves had been filled in and covered with flowers. The wooden toys were gone, taken into whatever realm the children now share together. I'm closing Little Sprouts Daycare this week. I can't risk any more children being exposed to whatever force lives on that land. The parents of the affected kids are getting psychiatric help for them, but I know therapy won't fix this. Those 6 children are no longer entirely human. They're part of something older, something that's been waiting patiently in these mountains for over a century. I've put the family property up for sale, though I doubt anyone will buy it once they research the history. And I'm moving away from Cedar Ridge, leaving North Carolina entirely, because sometimes at night, when the wind is right, I can hear 12 children singing together in the distance. 6 voices from 1892 and 6 from today, united in their eternal games. The dead children got what they'd been waiting for. They're not lonely anymore, but I'll carry the guilt of what I allowed to happen for the rest of my life, knowing that in trying to give 6 children a special weekend in nature, I delivered them into the hands of playmates who will never let them grow up, never let them go home, and never let them be fully alive again. I'm 20 years old, and up until 3 weeks ago, I was delivering pizza for Tony's in Hazard, Kentucky. I know that probably doesn't sound like the most dangerous job in the world, but after what happened to me on Devil's Creek Road, I can't even look at a pizza box without my hands starting to shake. I moved to Florida last week, about as far away from those mountains as I could get, but I'm still not sleeping right. I keep waking up around midnight, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. I guess I should start from the beginning. My name's Tyler, and I'd been working at Tony's for about 8 months when this happened. It wasn't a bad gig, honestly. Decent tips, flexible hours, and I knew the area pretty well since I'd grown up in Hazard. My route usually covered the main part of town and some of the easier mountain roads, nothing too crazy. Most of our regular customers were pretty normal folks, families, older people who didn't want to drive into town, that kind of thing. Mrs. Crenshaw was one of our regulars. Every Friday night, like clockwork, she'd call around 7 and order the same thing: large pepperoni pizza, extra cheese. She lived way up Devil's Creek Road, about 20 minutes from town, in this old farmhouse that had been in her family for generations. The road up there was narrow and winding, carved into the mountainside back in the 1940s when they were still logging that area heavily. Most drivers at Tony's didn't like making deliveries up there, especially at night, but I didn't mind it. Mrs. Crenshaw always paid cash and tipped well, and she was sweet, probably in her 70s, always asked about my family and how school was going. I'd been delivering to her for months without any problems. She'd usually be waiting on her front porch when I pulled up, rocking chair creaking, sometimes with a glass of sweet tea. Her house sat in this little clearing about a quarter-mile from the main road, surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides. It was the kind of place that probably felt isolated during the day, but cozy at night with the porch light on and smoke coming from the chimney. She had this old beagle named Rusty who'd come running up to my car every time, tail wagging like crazy. The area around Devil's Creek had a reputation, I guess. My grandmother used to tell stories about strange things happening up in those hills. People getting lost on trails they'd walked their whole lives, hearing voices calling their names from empty cabins, that sort of thing. But I'd always figured that was just mountain talk, you know? Every rural area has ghost stories. Plus, I'd been up that road dozens of times and never experienced anything weird. It was just another delivery route to me. That Friday night started normal enough. It was early October, and the leaves were just starting to change colors. I remember because I'd noticed how beautiful the mountains looked during my earlier deliveries that day. Tony's was busy. High school football game had just ended, and we were getting slammed with orders. I was running behind schedule when Mrs. Crenshaw's order came in around 8:30, later than usual for her. "Tyler, you mind taking the Crenshaw delivery?" Tony called out from behind the register. "I know it's out of your way, but Danny's already got 3 stops up north." "No problem," I said, grabbing the insulated bag. It was my last delivery of the night, and I was looking forward to getting home. I had plans to meet up with some friends later, maybe catch a movie. The drive up Devil's Creek Road was darker than usual that night. There wasn't much of a moon, and the trees seemed thicker somehow, hanging lower over the road. My headlights kept catching these weird shadows between the trees, but I figured it was just my imagination. I'd been working since 3 that afternoon, and I was tired. About halfway up the mountain, my radio started acting up. The classic rock station I always listened to began cutting in and out, replaced by this strange static that almost sounded like whispering. I tried adjusting the tuner, but every station was coming in fuzzy. Finally, I just turned it off. The silence felt heavy after that, like the mountains were pressing in on my little Honda Civic. When I pulled into Mrs. Crenshaw's driveway, the first thing I noticed was that her porch light wasn't on. That was unusual. She always had that light burning when she was expecting a delivery. The house looked completely dark, except for what might have been a faint glow coming from one of the upstairs windows. Rusty didn't come running out to greet me either, which was weird. That dog had never missed a chance to say hello. I sat in my car for a minute, engine running, trying to decide what to do. Maybe she'd fallen asleep waiting for me since I was running late. It happened sometimes with elderly customers. I grabbed the pizza bag and my flashlight from the glove compartment and headed toward the front porch. That's when I saw her. Mrs. Crenshaw was hanging upside down from the porch beam, suspended by what looked like an old rope tied around her ankles. But here's the thing that made my blood freeze. She was still alive. She was swaying slightly in the breeze, and she was singing. Not screaming, not crying for help, but singing this low, melodic tune that I'd never heard before. It sounded old, like a lullaby from another century. I dropped the pizza bag and fumbled for my phone, thinking I needed to call 911 immediately. But when Mrs. Crenshaw heard the sound of the box hitting the porch, she stopped singing and turned to look at me. That's when I saw her eyes. They were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, from corner to corner, was this deep, endless black-like, looking into a well at midnight. And when she saw me standing there, she smiled. Her teeth had changed too, grown into these sharp, needle-like points that caught what little light was filtering through the trees. "Hello, Tyler," she said, and her voice sounded like metal grinding against metal. The hungry ones have been waiting for you." I couldn't move. I literally couldn't make my legs work. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. This was Mrs. Crenshaw, the sweet old lady who always asked about my mother's garden and slipped me an extra $5 bill around Christmas. But hanging there upside down, with those black eyes and pointed teeth, she looked like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. That's when I heard the children laughing. It started as a faint giggling coming from the woods around the house, but there were no children anywhere that I could see. The laughter got closer and louder, and I could hear small feet running through the fallen leaves, circling around me. But every time I spun around to look, there was nothing there, just darkness and those damn invisible footsteps getting closer. Mrs. Crenshaw started spinning on that rope, slowly at first, then faster. As she spun, she raised one arm and pointed at me with fingers that had stretched into long, bone-white claws. "They haven't fed in so long, Tyler," she whispered, and somehow I could hear her perfectly, even though she was spinning and the children were laughing all around us. "Young flesh tastes the sweetest." That snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran for my car, but when I got there, I found all 4 tires slashed. Deep, deliberate cuts that had left them completely flat. Carved into the hood of my Honda were the words, "Feed us," scratched deep enough to reach the metal underneath. The invisible children thought this was hilarious. Their laughter got more excited, and I could feel small, ice-cold hands grabbing at my jacket from behind. When I spun around, there was nothing there, but I could see little footprints appearing in the dirt around my car, like invisible feet were dancing in circles. Then they started whispering my name, and somehow they knew things about me that no one should have known. Details about my life that I'd never told anyone. "Tyler works until midnight most nights," one small voice said right next to my ear. "Tyler lives alone in that little apartment behind the grocery store," said another. "Tyler's parents live in Ohio now. They won't miss him for days," came a third voice, and this one was giggling like it had just told the funniest joke in the world. I started running down the mountain road, leaving my car behind. The children followed me, still invisible but getting bolder. Every few seconds, tiny hands would grab at my legs or tug at my clothes. I could feel their fingers through my jeans, and they were cold as bone, sharp as needles. The worst part was that they were coordinating the hunt. I could hear them calling out instructions to each other in their high, sing-song voices. "Circle left. Drive him toward the creek. Don't let him reach the main road. Trap him at the bridge." They were herding me like a pack of wolves, and I realized this wasn't some random, supernatural encounter. They'd planned this. They'd been watching me, learning my route, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Mrs. Crenshaw's regular Friday night order wasn't just a routine, it was bait. As I ran down that dark mountain road, stumbling over roots and rocks, I started finding things hanging from the tree branches. Pizza delivery bags, just like the ones we used at Tony's. Each one had a name tag attached. Mike, 2019, Jessica, 2021, Carlos, 2022. The children's laughter got more excited every time I discovered another bag, like they were proud of their collection. I counted 6 bags total before I reached the old stone bridge that crossed Devil's Creek, about a mile down from Mrs. Crenshaw's house. The bridge was blocked. Someone had stacked pizza boxes 10 feet high across the entire span, creating a wall that I couldn't climb over or squeeze through. Written across the boxes in what looked like dried blood were the words, "Welcome to the feast, Tyler." I was trapped. The invisible children surrounded me on the bridge, and I could feel their breath on my neck, cold and musty. like air from a tomb that had been sealed for decades. One of them whispered directly into my ear, "Mrs. Crenshaw promised us a fresh meal tonight. We're so very hungry, Tyler. So very, very hungry." That's when I understood what was really happening. Mrs. Crenshaw wasn't some innocent victim who'd been possessed or attacked by these things. She was working with them. She'd been luring delivery drivers up to her house for years, feeding them to whatever these hungry spirits were in exchange for her own life. Mrs. Crenshaw appeared at the far end of the bridge, but she wasn't hanging upside down anymore. She was walking normally, her feet barely making any sound on the old stone. Her black eyes reflected what little starlight was filtering through the trees, and that sharp-toothed smile was wider than any human mouth should be able to stretch. "The mountain spirits need to feed every few months, Tyler," she said, and her voice still had that horrible metallic quality. "Outsiders make the best meals, people who won't be missed right away, people whose routines I can learn." Her mouth kept stretching as she talked, and I could see that she had rows of needle-sharp teeth, like a shark. "I've been serving them for 40 years now. Pizza boys, mail carriers, cable repairmen, anyone who comes up here alone and trusting." The invisible children started materializing around me on the bridge. They flickered in and out of visibility like old fluorescent lights. But when I could see them clearly, they were horrible. Pale, skeletal thin, with fingers that had grown into bone knives. They wore clothes from different decades: 1950s dresses, 1970s bell-bottoms, 1980s windbreakers, all faded and torn and stained with things I didn't want to identify. "They died in a mine collapse in 1952, Mrs. Crenshaw explained with sick satisfaction. 17 children trapped in a tunnel when the mountain shifted. They can't leave, they can't rest, and they can't stop being hungry." The ghost children reached for me with those bone-knife fingers, and I could smell decay on their breath, like meat that had been rotting for 70 years. One of them, a little girl in a torn blue dress, leaned close to my face and whispered, "We're going to eat you slowly, Tyler, starting with your fingers." That's when I remembered my phone. I pulled it out and turned on the flashlight, and the sudden bright beam made all the ghost children shriek and recoil like vampires. They didn't disappear, but they backed away from the light, hissing and covering their faces with those bone-white hands. Mrs. Crenshaw screamed from the other end of the bridge, "Turn it off. The light burns them. Turn it off." But I kept that flashlight beam moving, sweeping it back and forth across the bridge. The ghost children scattered to the edges, giving me just enough room to fight through the wall of pizza boxes. They clawed at me as I climbed, leaving deep scratches down my arms that I can still see today. But they couldn't get close enough to do real damage as long as I kept the light moving. My phone battery was dying, though. The light was getting dimmer every second, and every time it faded, the children got braver, creeping closer with their bone-knife fingers reaching for my throat. I made it through the wall of boxes just as my phone died completely. The children rushed forward with a sound like wind through dead leaves, but I was already running down the mountain road in complete darkness, stumbling and falling, but somehow staying ahead of those terrible reaching hands. I could hear them following me for what felt like miles, but gradually the sounds faded. When I finally saw headlights approaching on the main road, I flagged down a state trooper who was doing his evening patrol. Officer Martinez picked me up and listened to my story with the kind of professional patience that cops develop for dealing with crazy people. But when we drove back up Devil's Creek Road to investigate, we found Mrs. Crenshaw dead in her house. According to the coroner, she'd been dead for 3 days. Whatever I'd seen hanging from that porch beam was something else entirely, something that had been wearing her face. The pizza boxes on the bridge had vanished completely, but my delivery bag was found hanging from a tree with all the others. The state police took pictures and filed a report, but they never found any explanation for what had happened. My car was still there with the slashed tires and "Feed Us" carved into the hood, but they wrote it off as vandalism. I quit Tony's that night and moved to Miami the next week. I couldn't stand being in those mountains anymore. Couldn't stand the thought of making another delivery to some isolated house where things might be watching from the woods, waiting for their next meal. But it's not over. Last Friday, exactly 3 weeks after it happened, I found a pizza delivery flyer under my door here in Florida. It was for a place called Hungry Spirits Pizza, and it had my new address written on it in that same rusty brown ink that had been used on the pizza boxes. At the bottom, in small letters, were the words, "We found you, Tyler." Every night since then, around sunset, I hear children laughing outside my apartment. I live on the 3rd floor of a building with no kids anywhere nearby, but I hear them giggling and whispering my name. When I look out the window, there's never anyone there. I'm thinking about moving again, maybe going west this time. California or Oregon, somewhere with different mountains that don't know my name. But I have this feeling that it won't matter where I go. Those hungry spirits have been waiting in those hills for 70 years. What's a few more 1,000 miles to something that patient? I still deliver pizza, if you can believe that. Different company, different city, but it's the only job skill I really have. The difference is, I won't take any orders to isolated houses anymore. No mountain roads, no rural routes, nothing outside the well-lit city limits. My manager thinks I'm paranoid, but he doesn't argue with the restriction since I'm reliable for everything else. Sometimes, when I'm driving through Miami at night, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror for children that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, just for a second, I think I see them. I'm 29 and I run Mountain View Catering out of Wytheville, Virginia. Been doing weddings and corporate events across Southwest Virginia for about 10 years now, mostly serving folks in the smaller mountain towns where people still value home cooking and personal service. It's honest work, and I've built up a good reputation catering everything from church socials to fancy anniversary parties. Most of my business comes from word of mouth, which is how I like it. People trust me to make their special occasions memorable for the right reasons. Last October, I got a call from a young couple wanting me to cater their wedding at Sorrow's End Overlook, up near the Jefferson National Forest. Now, I'd heard of the place. It's this beautiful stone platform built back in 1889 by some wealthy family from Richmond who wanted a mountain retreat. The overlook sits on a natural shelf of rock about 300 feet above the valley, with views that stretch for miles across the Blue Ridge. It's the kind of spot that makes you understand why people fall in love with these mountains. The couple, Brad and Monica, had seen photos on Instagram and decided it was perfect for an intimate ceremony with about 80 guests. When Monica called to book me, she mentioned that several vendors had turned them down once they heard the location. They kept talking about some old ghost stories, she laughed. But we want drama and character, you know? Something unique. I'd heard whispers about Sorrow's End over the years. How a bride named Catherine had supposedly murdered her entire wedding party there in 1891. But I figured it was just the kind of local folklore that grows around any old, isolated place in these mountains. Ghost stories don't pay bills, and the couple was offering good money for what seemed like a straightforward job. The week before the wedding, I drove up to scout the location and plan my setup. The access road was rougher than I'd expected, just a gravel track that wound through thick oak and pine forest for about 3 miles before opening onto the overlook. The stone platform itself was impressive, probably 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with waist-high stone walls on 3 sides. Someone had maintained it well over the years. The stonework was solid and the surface was level, perfect for tables and a small dance area. What struck me immediately was how quiet it was up there. I mean, completely silent. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the trees. Just absolute stillness that felt almost heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I'd spent plenty of time in remote mountain locations for events, but I'd never experienced silence quite like that. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like something was waiting. I spent about 2 hours that afternoon walking the space, taking measurements, and planning the layout. The couple wanted a ceremony on the eastern end of the platform, with the reception area set up toward the west, where guests could watch the sunset during dinner. Standard setup, nothing complicated. As I was getting ready to leave, I noticed something odd carved into one of the stone pillars that supported the overlook's railing. It was a date, October 15th, 1891, with the words, "Till death do us part," carved underneath in flowing script. Monica had mentioned their wedding date was October 15th. Same day, 132 years apart. When I asked her about it later, she said they'd chosen the date because it was a Saturday that worked for their venue and vendors. She had no idea about the carving. "That's actually kind of romantic," she said, "like we're honoring the history of the place." The morning of the wedding, I arrived at sunrise with my crew, my assistant Sarah and 2 servers, Marcus and Jenny. We loaded our gear onto the overlook and started setting up tables, chairs, and the small portable kitchen I use for remote events. The forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 70s, perfect October weather. Everything was going smoothly until I started arranging the place settings. I always count my inventory carefully. For this wedding, I'd brought exactly 80 place settings of my good white china, plus a few extras in case of breakage. But as I was setting the tables, I kept finding additional place settings already arranged. Old-fashioned china with delicate blue flowers that definitely wasn't from my collection. The plates were heavier than modern dinnerware, with that thick, substantial feel of truly antique pieces. The first time I noticed it, there were 3 extra settings at one of the round tables near the eastern edge of the platform. I removed them, thinking maybe Sarah had pulled them from somewhere by mistake. But when I came back 15 minutes later to set up the centerpieces, the mystery place settings were back. Not just back, they'd multiplied. Now there were 5 extra settings, and they were arranged with military precision, the forks and knives perfectly aligned. I called Sarah over. "Did you put these here?" She looked at the table and frowned. "Those aren't ours. I've never seen that pattern before." I picked up one of the plates to examine it more closely. The china was beautiful, but clearly very old, with hairline cracks and the kind of wear you only see on pieces that have been used for decades. On the back, in faded gold script, was a maker's mark I didn't recognize and what looked like a date, 1890. That's when I noticed the names. Engraved around the rim of each plate in flowing script were names: Catherine, William, Margaret, Thomas, Henry. Old-fashioned names that fit the Victorian era of the china. I removed all the mystery place settings again, this time stacking them carefully on my serving table so I could ask the couple about them later. Maybe they belonged to the family that built the overlook, stored somewhere on the property. But by the time I'd finished arranging the centerpieces and came back to check the tables, the antique place settings had returned. Not just the original 5. Now there were 13 of them, spread across 4 different tables, all arranged with the same precise attention to detail. "This is getting weird," Sarah muttered. helping me collect the extra settings for the third time. Marcus came over from where he'd been setting up the portable kitchen. "Y'all seen anything strange about this place? My phone's been acting up all morning. GPS keeps showing I'm in the middle of a lake." I checked my own phone and found the same thing. According to the GPS, we were standing in the center of Sorrow's End Lake, about 200 feet underwater. Cell service was cutting in and out, even though I'd had full bars when I'd scouted the location the week before. Jenny was arranging chairs for the ceremony when she called out, "Ms. Jessica, you might want to see this." She was holding her digital camera, the good one I used to photograph finished setups for my portfolio. She'd been taking pictures of the ceremony area, but when she showed me the display screen, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The photos showed all our setup work, chairs arranged in perfect rows, the stone arch decorated with white roses and ivy. But they also showed people. 13 figures in elaborate Victorian wedding attire, sitting in chairs that appeared empty when we looked with our naked eyes. The figures were translucent but clearly defined, men in dark suits with high collars and women in ornate dresses with bustles and elaborate hats. They were all facing the front of the ceremony area, hands folded in their laps, as if waiting for the service to begin. And they were all staring directly at the camera. I grabbed the camera from Jenny and flipped through the photos. In every single shot, the phantom wedding guests were there, seated in different arrangements, but always maintaining that same patient, expectant posture. In one photo, a woman in an elaborate purple dress had turned completely around in her chair to look at us, her face sharp and clear despite the translucent quality of the image. I lowered the camera and looked at the ceremony area with my naked eyes. Empty chairs, flower arrangements, stone platform, nothing else. "Did everyone just see that?" I asked quietly. Sarah nodded, her face pale. "Those people, they were dressed like they were from the 1800s. By this point it was almost noon, and the wedding party would be arriving soon for photos before the 4 p.m. ceremony. I made a decision that I still question to this day. I decided to continue with the job. Maybe it was professional pride, maybe it was denial, but I convinced myself that whatever was happening wasn't dangerous, just unusual. I told my crew we weren't going to mention the phantom guests or the mysterious place settings to anyone. "Let's just focus on doing our job," I said. "We can figure out the weird stuff later." But the weird stuff wasn't done with us. Around 2 p.m., the wedding party arrived for photos. Monica looked absolutely radiant in a vintage-style gown with intricate beadwork and a long train. She'd chosen the dress to complement the historic setting, she told me, and she'd been right. She looked like she could have stepped out of the 1890s herself. The moment Monica stepped onto the stone platform, something changed about her. The bright, cheerful energy she'd had during all our planning meetings seemed to dim, replaced by something more formal and distant. Her posture became more rigid, and when she spoke, there was a slight southern accent I'd never noticed before. "Thank you all for coming to witness this blessed union," she said to the photographer's assistant, who was just adjusting some equipment. The assistant looked confused. The ceremony hadn't started, and there was no one else around to address. Brad, the groom, seemed to notice the change too. "Babe, you okay? You seem different." Monica turned to him with a smile that was beautiful but somehow cold. "I'm perfectly well, William. This is going to be a perfect ceremony." "It's Brad," he corrected gently. "Of course," she said, but I heard her mutter "William" under her breath as she walked away. During the photo session, I watched Monica carefully. She kept looking toward the empty ceremony chairs as if she could see people sitting there. Several times, she waved or nodded at seemingly empty air. When the photographer asked her to look at the camera, she would first glance toward the phantom seating area, as if seeking approval from invisible guests. The most unsettling moment came when she insisted on having photos taken with the rest of the wedding party. She gestured toward an empty section of the platform and began posing next to nothing, arranging her dress as if making room for other people in the frame. The photographer went along with it, thinking it was some kind of artistic vision, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. As the ceremony time approached, more guests began arriving, real guests in modern wedding attire who seemed completely unaware of the atmospheric wrongness that my crew and I were experiencing. They mingled and chatted, took photos with the beautiful mountain views, and complimented the setup. Normal wedding behavior in a distinctly abnormal situation. But Monica continued to change. By the time she walked down the aisle at 4 p.m., she was moving in an old-fashioned, formal style, shorter steps, more deliberate posture, that didn't match her personality at all. When she reached the front of the ceremony area, she spent a long moment looking at the empty chairs before turning to face Reverend Thompson, who would be officiating. The ceremony itself started normally enough. Reverend Thompson, a kind man in his 60s who'd been performing mountain weddings for decades, began with the traditional processional words. But when Monica started speaking her vows, I heard something that made my blood run cold. She spoke each line twice, first in her normal voice, then again in a more formal, archaic style that sounded like it belonged to a different century. "I, Monica, take you, Brad, to be my husband," she said clearly. Then, in a voice that was somehow older and more refined, "I, Catherine, take thee, William, to be my wedded husband." The guests didn't seem to notice. They were too far away and probably assumed she was just nervous. But Reverend Thompson was close enough to hear both versions. His face went pale, but he continued with the ceremony, probably thinking she was just overwhelmed by the moment. When Brad spoke his vows, Monica listened with an expression that grew more satisfied and more chilling with each word. When he promised to love her till death do us part, she smiled with genuine pleasure and whispered something that sounded like, "Yes, just like before." Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, and Monica's eyes rolled back for just a moment before she fixed them on Brad with an intensity that made him step backwards slightly. "Finally, William," she said, her voice completely changed now to the archaic accent. "We can complete what was interrupted so long ago." She turned to face the wedding guests with an expression of pure, cold hatred. "You all came to witness a wedding," she announced in that strange, formal voice that carried across the platform despite being barely above a whisper. "Just as they did in 1891. But this time I'll make sure every guest gets exactly what they deserve." That's when she reached into her bouquet and pulled out an antique knife. The blade was maybe 6 inches long, with an ornate handle that matched the Victorian era of the mysterious place settings. Monica held it with practiced familiarity, as if she'd used it many times before. The wedding guests, who still couldn't hear her clearly from where they were seated, began to applaud, thinking the ceremony was over. Monica took a step toward the guest tables, raising the knife. And then the phantom place settings burst into flames. All 13 antique place settings erupted in blue-white fire that gave off no heat, but filled the air with the smell of burning roses and old wood. The flames reached toward the sky like reaching hands, and from somewhere that seemed both very far away and right next to my ear, I heard screaming. Men's voices, women's voices, all crying out in terror and agony. The sound of people running, chairs falling over, the wet sounds of violence. But when I looked at the ceremony area, I saw only empty chairs and the impossible fire rising from plates that had appeared without anyone placing them. Monica froze mid-step, the knife wavering in her hand. Her face contorted as if she was fighting some internal battle, her features shifting between the woman I'd been working with for weeks and something older, angrier, more desperate. "No," she gasped in her normal voice. "Not again. Not like this." But the other voice, Catherine's voice, snarled back, "They came to witness a wedding. They'll get what the others got." The flames from the place settings grew higher, and now I could see shapes moving within them, figures in Victorian dress, dancing and writhing in the fire. I realized I was watching the ghost of Catherine's original wedding party, trapped in an eternal celebration of their own murder. Monica's body shuddered violently as Catherine's spirit fought to maintain control. The antique knife clattered to the stone platform as Monica fell to her knees, her wedding dress spreading around her like spilled cream. The flames reached their peak and then suddenly collapsed inward, as if being sucked into some invisible vortex. The screaming stopped, the place settings vanished, and Catherine's presence was pulled away from Monica's body like smoke being drawn up a chimney. Monica collapsed completely, unconscious but breathing. Brad rushed to her side, followed by Reverend Thompson and several guests. When she came to a few minutes later, she had no memory of the possession or the knife. She remembered walking down the aisle, saying her vows, being pronounced married. Everything after that was a blank. We never found the antique knife. It had vanished along with Catherine's presence and the mysterious place settings. The wedding reception proceeded normally. Monica was herself again, cheerful and grateful, apologizing for fainting from the excitement. The guests had a wonderful time, completely unaware of what had really happened. But I knew. My crew knew. And Reverend Thompson knew. We finished the job because that's what professionals do, but none of us spoke about what we'd witnessed. What would we have said? Who would have believed us? I've been back to that part of the mountains several times since then for other events, but never again to Sorrow's End Overlook. The county actually closed it to weddings about a month after Monica and Brad's ceremony. The official reason was structural concerns, but I suspect Reverend Thompson had a quiet word with someone in the county office. Sometimes hikers still report seeing lights up there on October 15th, Victorian figures dancing on the stone platform, celebrating a wedding that ended in massacre 132 years ago. Catherine finally got her perfect ceremony, where all the guests stayed exactly as long as she wanted them to. I still do mountain weddings, but I'm a lot more careful about researching venues now. And I always trust my instincts when a place feels wrong. Some locations carry their history too close to the surface, and some brides never really let go of their special day. Monica and Brad seem happy, by the way. They moved to North Carolina a few months after the wedding, and I get Christmas cards from them every year. Monica never mentions feeling different that day, and I've never told her what I saw. Some things are better left buried, but I still have those photos on Jenny's camera, the ones showing the phantom wedding guests. I've never shown them to anyone, but on quiet nights I sometimes look through them, studying those translucent faces staring back at the camera with such patient malevolence. They're still there, waiting for the next bride who wants drama and character for her wedding day. Waiting for someone else who doesn't believe in old mountain stories about places where love turned to murder. I hope they keep waiting for a very long time. I'm 24 years old, and for the past 3 years I've been delivering mail to the remote farms scattered throughout Bone Hollow in eastern Tennessee. Most people think mail delivery is boring, But honestly, I loved my route. It took me through some of the most beautiful country you've ever seen. Rolling hills covered in thick forests, old farmhouses that have been in families for generations, and roads so quiet you might not see another car all day. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady work, and after bouncing between dead-end jobs since high school, steady felt pretty good. I knew every family on my route personally. Mrs. Patterson always had fresh tomatoes waiting for me in the summer. Old Carl Winters would flag me down just to chat about the weather or complain about the government. The Hendricks family, Jim, Susan, and their teenage son Kyle, they were probably my favorite stop. Jim always had some story about the old days when his grandfather ran cattle through those hills, and Susan would send me home with mason jars of honey from their beehives. Kyle was quiet, but he'd wave from whatever project he was working on in their barn. They were good people, the kind who'd drop everything to help a neighbor. That's what made everything that happened so much worse. When something terrible happens to strangers, it's awful. But when it happens to people you care about, people you see every day, it changes you in ways you don't expect. I still drive mail routes, but I transferred to a suburban area outside Nashville. I don't deliver to rural farms anymore, and I don't think I ever will again. Bone Hollow got its name from all the old cattle bones settlers found scattered through the valley back in the 1800s. According to local stories, some disease had wiped out entire herds, leaving nothing but bones bleaching white in the sun. The name stuck, even though the valley had been beautiful farmland for over a century. Most of the families there had been working the same land for 4 or 5 generations. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where people still helped each other during harvest time, and where the biggest excitement was usually the annual church social. The Hendricks farm sat about halfway through my route, right where the main road curved around a stand of old oak trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Their mailbox was one of those old metal ones painted bright red, sitting at the end of a gravel driveway that wound up to a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch. Jim had built that mailbox himself, he'd told me once, because the cheap ones from the hardware store never lasted more than a few winters. For 3 years, my routine never varied. I'd pull up to their mailbox around 2 p.m., sort through their mail, and either leave it in the box or walk it up to the house if there was a package. Sometimes Jim would be working in the yard and we'd chat for a few minutes. Sometimes Susan would be hanging laundry and would wave from the clothesline. Kyle was usually in school during the week, but I'd see him on Saturdays, working on his truck or helping his dad with farm chores. 2 weeks before everything went wrong, I started noticing small changes. Jim began appearing at the mailbox every single day at exactly 2 p.m. Not working in the yard where he might wander over, but standing there waiting, like he'd been watching the road for my truck. At first I thought maybe he was expecting something important, tax documents or medical bills or something that needed his immediate attention. But when I asked if he was waiting for anything specific, he just said, "Mail time, Maria," which was strange because he'd never called our daily routine mail time before. The second thing I noticed was his posture. Jim had always been a tall man, but now he seemed stretched somehow, like someone had taken his normal proportions and pulled them longer. His arms hung lower than they should, and his torso looked extended, as if his spine had been quietly adding extra vertebrae. When I mentioned to my supervisor that Jim Hendricks seemed to be losing weight, she just laughed and said farm work kept people lean. But this wasn't lean. This was wrong. Then there was his voice. Jim had always had a deep, gravelly voice from years of smoking before he quit. But now when he spoke, there was a strange quality to it, like he was speaking through a broken radio. The words came out just a fraction of a second before his mouth moved, as if someone was playing a recording and he was trying to match the lip movements. "Mail time, Maria," he'd say, but I'd hear the words before I saw his lips form them. Susan started appearing with him during the second week. She'd stand right beside him at the mailbox, both of them waiting in that unnaturally still way. Susan had always been animated, gesturing with her hands when she talked, constantly moving. But this version of Susan stood perfectly motionless except for a slight swaying, like she was a plant moving in a breeze I couldn't feel. Her movements matched Jim's exactly. When he shifted his weight, she shifted hers at the same moment, in the same direction. By the end of that first week, Kyle had joined them. All three family members standing in perfect formation by their red mailbox, waiting for me at exactly 2 p.m. They looked like the Hendricks family, but everything about them felt rehearsed, like actors who had studied the roles but didn't quite understand the characters. When they spoke, which was rare, they often spoke in unison. "Any mail for the Hendricks family?" Their voices layered over each other in a way that should have created chaos, but instead made this eerie harmony that made my skin crawl. The strange behavior escalated quickly after that. By Monday of the second week, there were 7 figures standing at the Hendricks mailbox. Not 7 different people. 7 versions of the Hendricks family. 3 that looked like Jim, 2 that looked like Susan, and 2 that looked like Kyle, all with that same stretched, wrong appearance. Their skin had taken on a gray, waxy quality that reflected sunlight like wet plastic. When a cloud passed over the sun, their skin seemed to absorb the shadow differently than normal skin would. I sat in my mail truck, staring at this impossible scene, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical part of my brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe Jim had brothers who looked similar. Maybe Susan had sisters visiting. Maybe Kyle had cousins staying for the summer. But the resemblance wasn't just similar. It was identical, down to the exact same clothes, the same posture, the same slightly tilted head. When I worked up the courage to ask about the extra family members, all 7 of them turned to look at me with that same impossible head tilt, like they were connected by invisible strings. "We are all Hendricks," they said in perfect unison, their voices creating that unsettling harmony that made my teeth ache. The sound echoed off the hills in a way that voices shouldn't echo, like the landscape itself was amplifying their words. That's when I started noticing the red cloth strips. They hadn't been there before, I was certain of that. But now every fence post along the road leading to the Hendricks house had strips of bright red fabric tied to it, fluttering in the breeze like prayer flags or warnings. The strips were all exactly the same size and tied with identical knots, as if someone had measured and planned each placement with mathematical precision. The stone cairns appeared overnight. Small piles of rocks stacked along the roadside with items balanced on top. Items I recognized with growing horror. My name tag from my postal uniform. Buttons that had been torn from my shirt. A pen I'd been carrying in my pocket. A hair tie I thought I'd lost. Each cairn held some piece of me, some personal item that had gone missing over the past few weeks without me realizing it. I started checking my uniform more carefully after that, and I realized things were disappearing regularly. A thread from my sleeve. A small tear in my pants that grew slightly larger each day. Someone was collecting pieces of me, studying the details of my appearance with methodical precision. The thought made me sick, but it also made me understand what I was really looking at when I saw those 7 identical Hendricks family members. They weren't the real Hendricks family. Something else was wearing their shapes, learning how to be human by copying the people it had observed. And now it was studying me, collecting the physical details it would need to copy my appearance just as perfectly as it had copied theirs. On Monday of the third week, I saw myself standing with the Hendricks family at their mailbox. It was wearing my exact uniform, not just similar, but identical down to the small stain on the front pocket where I'd spilled coffee 3 days earlier. It had my face, my hair, my posture, but the proportions were slightly stretched like all the others. When I stopped my truck, both the original group of fake Hendricks and this new version that included a fake me turned to stare in my direction. The fake Maria waved at me with a motion that was almost right, but not quite, like someone copying a gesture they'd seen but didn't understand the underlying emotion. "Mail time, Maria," it said in my own voice, but with that same delayed mouth movement I'd noticed in the fake Jim. Hearing my own voice speaking to me from outside my body was like being trapped in the worst kind of nightmare. I couldn't move for several seconds, just sat there gripping the steering wheel while this thing wearing my face smiled at me with too many teeth. When I finally managed to put the truck in reverse and back away from the mailbox, I saw in my rearview mirror that the fake me was getting into what looked like an identical copy of my postal truck. Every detail was perfect except for the way it moved, too fluid, too purposeful, like a person who had learned to drive by watching but had never felt the emotional connection between human and machine. The smell hit me as soon as I'd driven 100 yards. Battery acid mixed with rotting meat, so strong it made my eyes water. My truck's radio crackled to life on its own, playing what sounded like recordings of my own voice saying things I'd never said. "Maria is learning to be better, Maria," my voice said through the static. "Original Maria will teach us how to be perfect, Maria." The words were spoken in my exact tone and inflection, but they felt alien, like someone had taken recordings of me and rearranged them into new sentences. I realized with growing horror that I was watching something practice. This entity, whatever it was, had been studying human behavior by collecting and wearing people-like costumes. It had started with the Hendricks family, learning their routines, their speech patterns, their relationships with each other and with me. Now it was adding me to its collection, creating new versions that could blend seamlessly into human society. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, but when I tried to explain what I'd seen, Deputy Collins just looked at me like I'd been drinking. He took down my information and promised to drive by the Hendricks place, but I could tell he thought I was having some kind of breakdown. When I called my supervisor to report the incident, she told me that another Maria Gonzalez had already called in sick for me that day and had arranged for coverage of my route. That night, I researched everything I could find about the Hendricks family. What I discovered made everything worse. According to missing person reports filed 3 weeks earlier by concerned neighbors, Jim, Susan, and Kyle Hendricks had disappeared from their farm without any sign of struggle or explanation. Their vehicles were still in the driveway. Their livestock were still being fed, but the family themselves had simply vanished. The next morning, I drove back to Bone Hollow, keeping my distance but watching through binoculars from a hill overlooking the valley. I saw their bodies being removed from a cave system behind the Hendricks house. The news report later said they'd been found perfectly preserved but completely desiccated, like empty husks that had been drained of everything that made them human while maintaining their exact physical appearance. Something had been wearing their skins like costumes, learning how to be human by mimicking their daily routines and relationships. The fake Hendricks family had been practicing social interactions with me during my mail delivery. getting more accurate each day as they studied my reactions and speech patterns. I had been their unwitting teacher, showing them how humans behaved in normal, everyday situations. When I tried to return to work the next day, my supervisor told me that my position had already been filled. Maria Gonzalez was doing an excellent job on the Bone Hollow route, she said. The customers loved her. She was always punctual, always professional, and never caused any problems. When I insisted that I was Maria Gonzalez, she looked at me with genuine confusion and suggested I might need professional help. I drove to Bone Hollow one last time, staying far from the main road but close enough to watch. There were now 5 different versions of me delivering mail to different houses throughout the valley. Each one was slightly different. One taller, one with longer arms, one with a neck that bent at an impossible angle. They were still experimenting, still perfecting their human disguises by testing different variations of my appearance. When they noticed me watching from the hill, all 5 fake Marias stopped what they were doing and turned to look directly at me, even though I was more than a mile away. They smiled in perfect unison with too many teeth, and I heard my own voice carried on the wind. Original Maria has come to play with us. I ran back to my truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. When I popped the hood, I found that someone had been tampering with the engine, removing specific parts and rearranging others in patterns that made no mechanical sense. The missing parts were arranged on the ground in neat piles, like an entity that understood that cars needed these components but didn't understand how they worked together. I started walking, following old logging roads I remembered from my mail route. Behind me, I could hear multiple versions of my own voice calling my name from different directions, growing closer. "This is how Maria runs," the voices said, studying my movement patterns even as I fled. "This is how Maria breathes when she's scared. This is how Maria's heart sounds when she's hiding." I spent that night in an abandoned hunting cabin, listening to things that sounded like me circling the building and testing the doors and windows. They never tried to break in. They just wanted to observe, to learn how I reacted to being trapped and hunted. In the morning, they were gone, but they'd left new stone cairns around the cabin with fresh pieces of my clothing and hair. I hitchhiked to Nashville and never went back to Bone Hollow. I found out later that Maria Gonzalez had been reporting to work at the post office every day since my disappearance, doing my job with mechanical perfection. According to her supervisor, she never called in sick, never showed up late, and never displayed any personal preferences or emotions. She was the ideal employee, which should have been the first sign that something was wrong. I tried to file police reports, but every time I explained the situation, officers would tell me that Maria Gonzalez was a well-respected postal worker with no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. They implied that I was the one with problems, possibly suffering from identity confusion or trying to steal someone else's life. The fact that the fake me was doing my job better than I ever had made my claims seem even more unbelievable. It's been 6 months now, and I've rebuilt my life in a different city under a slightly different name. I work suburban mail routes where I know every street, every house, and every normal family. I avoid rural areas completely, and I pay attention to details that most people never notice. The way someone moves, the timing of their speech, the quality of their skin in direct sunlight. Sometimes I wonder how many of the people I see every day are really themselves, and how many are something else wearing human shapes. I wonder if that thing in Bone Hollow was unique, or if there are others scattered throughout the mountains, collecting identities and practicing how to be human. I still get mail sometimes addressed to my old name, forwarded from my old address. Bills, Advertisements, official notices, all the mundane paperwork of a life I no longer live. But sometimes there are letters with no return address, written in handwriting that looks exactly like mine, describing daily activities and thoughts I never had. Someone is living my old life more successfully than I ever did, and sending me updates to let me know how much better she's doing as me than I ever was as myself. The most recent letter arrived last week. It was signed in my handwriting and contained a photo of my old mail truck with someone who looked exactly like me standing beside it, smiling. On the back of the photo, written in my own handwriting, were the words, "Maria is perfect now. Thank you for teaching us how to be better." I burned the letter immediately, but I kept the photo. Sometimes I stare at it and try to convince myself that the person in the picture is me, that I imagined everything that happened in Bone Hollow. But I know the truth. That thing learned how to be me more completely than I ever knew how to be myself. And somewhere in those Tennessee hills, it's still wearing my face and living my life, doing my job with inhuman perfection. And the worst part is, I'm pretty sure it's happy. I'm 27 years old, and I drive Route 47 for Appalachian County schools in rural Virginia. Been doing it for about 3 years now. Ever since I moved back home after college didn't work out the way I planned. My parents always said I'd end up back in the mountains, and honestly, they weren't wrong. There's something about these hills that keeps pulling you back, even when you think you want to leave. The pay isn't great, but it's steady work, and I get my summers off to help my dad with his small engine repair business. Plus, I actually like the kids, most of them anyway. They're good mountain kids, respectful, and they've got stories about their families going back generations in these hollows. My route covers about 15 miles of winding mountain roads, picking up kids from some of the most isolated farms and cabins you've ever seen. Some of these families live so far back in the hills that their driveways are longer than most city streets. I've got stops at places where the GPS just gives up and shows blank green space, where families have been living on the same land since before the Civil War. The kids I pick up are used to walking a mile or more just to reach the main road where I can safely turn the bus around. It's not easy work. These mountain roads weren't designed for something as big as a school bus, and in winter, it gets downright dangerous. But these kids need to get to school, and their parents depend on me to get them there safely. The thing about driving the same route every day is that you start to notice everything. Every tree, every mailbox, every bend in the road becomes familiar. You know where the potholes are, which dogs are going to chase the bus, and exactly how long it takes to get from one stop to the next. After 3 years, I could probably drive Route 47 blindfolded. That's why what happened 2 weeks ago was so unsettling. Something had changed on a route I knew like the back of my hand. It was a Tuesday morning in early October, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I remember because I was thinking about how pretty the mountains looked with all those reds and yellows mixed in with the green. I was running my usual morning route, picking up the Henderson kids first, then the Williams family, working my way deeper into the mountains toward the more remote stops. Everything was normal until I came around the bend near Miller's Creek, about 8 miles into my route. There was a bus stop there that I'd never seen before. Now, I know that sounds crazy. I've driven this road hundreds of times, and I know every stop on my route. But there it was, a wooden sign that said Pine Ridge Stop at the mouth of a dirt road I could have sworn wasn't there the day before. The sign looked old, weathered, like it had been there for years. The dirt road disappeared back into thick woods, winding up the hillside where I couldn't see where it led. I pulled over and checked my route sheet. the clipboard with all the official stops written down by the transportation department. And there it was, listed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Pine Ridge Stop, 7:45 a.m. The weird thing was, I was sure that entry hadn't been there yesterday. I would have remembered adding a new stop. That's the kind of thing they make a big deal about at the transportation office. 3 children were waiting there, 2 girls and a boy. All looked to be around 8 or 9 years old. They were standing perfectly still by the sign, not talking or playing like kids usually do while they wait for the bus. They just stood there, watching me approach with these serious expressions that seemed too old for their faces. Something about them made me uncomfortable right away, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I opened the door, and they climbed on without saying a word. Usually kids are chatty in the mornings, especially the younger ones, but these 3 just filed past me in complete silence and went straight to the very back of the bus. They sat down together in the back seat, all 3 of them crammed into one seat, even though there were plenty of empty ones. "Good morning," I said, trying to be friendly. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. What are your names?" They just stared at me, not in a shy way, but with these intense, unblinking eyes that made my skin crawl. I realized I hadn't seen them blink once since they got on the bus. Kids blink constantly. It's just something you notice when you work with them every day. But these 3 just stared with wide, unmoving eyes. "Are you new to the area?" I tried again. Still nothing. They didn't even look at each other or whisper among themselves like normal kids would. They just sat there, perfectly still, watching me in the rearview mirror. The rest of my route felt different that day. The other kids seemed nervous, shooting glances back at the 3 new passengers and then looking away quickly. Usually the bus is full of chatter and laughter, but everyone was unusually quiet. Even the high school kids, who normally don't pay attention to the younger ones, kept turning around to look at them. When we got to the elementary school, something else strange happened. Instead of getting off with the other kids, the 3 from Pine Ridge Stop just sat there until everyone else was gone. Then they stood up in unison, walked to the front of the bus, and stepped off without a word. I watched them in my side mirror as they walked across the parking lot, expecting them to go into the school building like all the other kids. Instead, they walked straight past the school and disappeared into the woods behind it. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Maybe they were being picked up by someone. Maybe their parents worked back there somewhere. But the woods behind the school were thick and went on for miles. There weren't any houses or roads back that way. I made a mental note to ask the principal about them when I came back for the afternoon route. But when I asked, nobody at the school had any record of 3 new students. No enrollment forms, no transfer paperwork, nothing. The secretary looked at me like I was confused and suggested maybe I'd miscounted or seen the same kid twice. I knew what I'd seen, but I didn't want to push it and sound crazy. The next morning, the same 3 children were waiting at Pine Ridge Stop. This time I really studied their faces, trying to memorize their features so I could describe them if I needed to. But that's when I noticed something that still gives me chills thinking about it. Their faces were somehow hard to focus on, like trying to look at something underwater. I'd think I had their features fixed in my mind. But then when I looked again, they seemed slightly different. More children appeared the next day. 5 of them this time, all with that same quiet, unblinking stare. Then 7, then 9. They all looked like they could be related, similar builds, similar coloring, but their features kept shifting in ways that made my eyes water if I stared too long. When I tried to take attendance, writing down their names so I could report to the office, the strangest thing happened. Their names kept changing on my clipboard. I'd write down Emma, John, Katie while looking at them. But when I looked at the paper again 5 minutes later, it would say Mary, William, Beth in my own handwriting. I started taking pictures of my attendance sheet with my phone, but the photos always came out blurry, like the camera couldn't focus on their names. The regular kids on my bus were getting more and more uncomfortable. Jessica Williams, one of my 7th graders, finally came up to me after school one day. "Mrs. Patterson," she whispered, "those new kids smell like wet dirt and old leaves. And their faces..." She shuddered. "Their faces look different every time I look at them." Tommy Henderson, one of my high school kids, was more direct. "Something's wrong with those kids," he said. "They don't act right. Yesterday I saw one of them turn its head all the way around to look behind us, like an owl. That's not normal." I started watching them more carefully in my rearview mirror during the ride to school. What I saw made me question my own sanity. Their reflections in the mirror didn't quite match what I saw when I turned around to look at them directly. In the mirror, sometimes their eyes looked too large for their faces, or their mouths seemed to stretch wider than humanly possible. But when I'd turn to look at them with my own eyes, they'd appear normal again, just unusually quiet children. One morning, I decided to test something. I drove right past Pine Ridge Stop without slowing down, just to see what would happen. In my rearview mirror, I watched the waiting children's faces change. The disappointment was immediate and obvious, but then something else happened. Their features began shifting more dramatically than I'd ever seen before. Their eyes grew larger and darker, their mouths stretched into impossibly wide grins, and their heads tilted at angles that would snap a normal person's neck. I made it maybe half a mile down the road before I heard my regular students start screaming. The Pine Ridge children were sitting in the back of my bus. I hadn't stopped to pick them up. I hadn't even seen them running to catch up. They had simply appeared in the seats while I was driving, and they were no longer bothering to look human. One had the face of a wolf with human eyes. Another looked like an elderly woman with a child's body and fingers that were too long and bent in wrong directions. The third was shifting constantly, sometimes a child, sometimes an adult, sometimes something with too many teeth. "Driver must follow the route," they said in perfect unison, their voices layering over each other in a way that made my teeth ache. "Driver cannot skip our stop." I slammed on the brakes and pulled over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. The regular kids were crying and trying to climb over the seats to get away from the back of the bus. I turned around to face whatever those things were, but they were already gone. I watched them flow out of the bus seats like liquid shadow and pour out the windows, leaving behind only the smell of damp earth and decay. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it had been some kind of hallucination or breakdown. But the next morning, when I went to start my route, Pine Ridge Stop was on all the official county maps. It was listed in the Transportation Department's computer system. Everyone acted like it had always been there. I started doing research on the area where that dirt road appeared. There was no record of any settlement called Pine Ridge in the county historical records. The road itself wasn't on any maps from before this month, but somehow it existed now, winding back into hills that had supposedly been uninhabited wilderness for over a century. I talked to some of the older folks in town, the ones whose families had been in these mountains for generations. Mrs. Ellis, who's lived here her whole 93 years, got a strange look in her eyes when I described what I'd been seeing. "Honey," she said, "my grandmother used to tell stories about the changing ones. things that lived deep in the forest, older than any human settlement. She said they could take any shape they wanted, but they needed regular contact with people to keep their abilities strong. They were always looking for ways to study us, to learn how to be more like us. The more I learned, the more terrified I became. The Pine Ridge children weren't just playing some kind of game. They were studying human behavior, learning to mimic us more perfectly. Every day they rode my bus, they got better at acting like real children. Their movements became more natural, their expressions more believable. But I started noticing them around town too, sitting in the school cafeteria, though no teachers could remember them enrolling, playing on the playground, though no parents claimed them, walking through downtown with families who insisted these children had always been theirs. The shapeshifters were integrating themselves into the community, and somehow they were making everyone believe they belonged. Real children started disappearing, not all at once. That would have caused a panic. Just one here and one there, always quietly. A kid would be reported as staying home sick, and then everyone would forget they'd ever existed. The shapeshifters were replacing them one by one, using what they'd learned from riding my bus to perfect their disguises. When I tried to report this to the authorities, they looked at me like I was having some kind of breakdown. The sheriff suggested I take some time off, maybe see a counselor. Even my own family started treating me differently, like I was fragile and needed to be handled carefully. The worst part was that Pine Ridge Stop now appeared on all the official county maps, and everyone insisted it had always been there. The shapeshifters had somehow rewritten reality itself to include their presence. I couldn't prove anything. Every piece of evidence I tried to gather would disappear or change. Photos came out blurred or distorted. Documents would be altered when I wasn't looking. The one time I tried to bring someone else to witness what was happening, the Pine Ridge children appeared completely normal, perfectly behaved, properly human children who smiled and waved and answered questions in sweet, innocent voices. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what they really were. Last Friday was my final day driving the route. I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't be responsible for helping these things infiltrate our community. I told the transportation department I was quitting for personal reasons, and they found a replacement within a day. Too quickly, if you ask me. Like they'd been expecting it. Now I see them everywhere in town. The changing ones, wearing faces they've stolen, living lives they've copied from the children they've replaced. Most of the time they look perfectly human, but sometimes, if you catch them when they think no one is watching, their faces shift slightly. An eye that's the wrong color. A smile that's too wide. Features that don't quite match the lighting. They've made their place in our world now, and somehow they've convinced everyone else that they belong here. Everyone except me. They wave when they see me, with faces that look almost human, like they're thanking me for my help. Because that's what I did, isn't it? I helped them learn to be us. My bus route was their training ground, their laboratory for studying human behavior. I moved away from the area last month, found work in a different county, but I still have nightmares about those children. I keep wondering how many other places they've infiltrated, how many other bus routes they're using to study and replace us. And I keep thinking about that empty dirt road that leads to Pine Ridge, wondering what else might be waiting back there in the woods, learning to wear our faces and live our lives. Sometimes I wonder if the person who replaced me as the bus driver is even human, or if they're just another one of the changing ones, helping to bring more of their kind into our world. To this day, I won't drive through rural areas alone, and I always watch children very carefully now, looking for the signs I learned to recognize, the eyes that don't blink often enough, The faces that shift when you're not looking directly at them. The reflections that don't quite match reality. Because once you've seen what they really are, you can never stop looking for them. I'm 30 years old, and I still wake up some nights with the taste of metal in my mouth, thinking about what I lost in Tin Creek. See, I used to run Dave's auto repair there, inherited it from my granddad when I was 22. 8 years I kept that place going. 8 years of being the only mechanic in a town of 340 souls tucked between two ridges in West Virginia. It wasn't much, but it was mine. More importantly, it was home for me and my daughter Emma. Emma's mom left when Em was just 3, said she couldn't handle small-town life anymore. Can't say I blamed her, but it meant Emma and I became a team. Every day after school, she'd come to the shop and do her homework in the little office while I worked on whatever truck or car needed fixing. She was 8 when this all started, smart as a whip and curious about everything. She knew the sound of every engine in town, could identify Mrs. Patterson's wheezing Ford or Bill Henderson's diesel truck just by listening. The garage wasn't just my livelihood, it was our life together. Emma had this thing where she'd name the cars that came in. Mrs. Patterson's Ford was Wheezy, and old Tom's Chevy was Grumbles, because of the way the exhaust rumbled. She'd sit on her little stool next to my workbench, swinging her legs and chattering about school while I worked. Those were the best parts of my day, hearing her laugh echo off the garage walls. She wanted to be a mechanic too, she said. Just like Daddy. The thing about Tin Creek is that everybody knows everybody, and everybody's business is everybody's business. When someone's transmission goes out, the whole town knows about it by supper time. When young folks move away for college or jobs in the city, we all feel the loss. When someone dies, we all go to the funeral. It's the kind of place where you leave your doors unlocked, and your neighbors will check on you if they don't see your lights on at the usual time. That community, that connection, it was everything to me and Emma. After her mom left, the whole town kind of adopted us. Mary Chen from the post office would bring Emma cookies. Bill Henderson would stop by just to chat and let Emma pet his old hunting dog. Mrs. Patterson treated Emma like the granddaughter she never had. We weren't just surviving in Tin Creek. We were part of something bigger, something that felt permanent and safe. Which is why what happened that Tuesday in September still haunts me. Because I didn't just lose my business that day. I didn't just lose my understanding of how the world works. I lost my daughter's childhood, our home, our whole life. And the worst part is, I let it happen. I made choices that put her in danger because I was trying to hold on to everything I thought mattered. It was about 3 in the afternoon when I heard tires on the gravel outside. Emma was at her usual spot, working on a math worksheet and humming some song from school. I was under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's Ford. Wheezy was acting up again, burning through alternators faster than I could replace them. The engine I heard pulling up sounded wrong, too smooth, too quiet for anything in these mountains. When I wiped my hands and walked outside, Emma following behind me like she always did, what I saw made me instinctively step in front of her. The truck looked like something from the 1950s, but the metal was all wrong. Too smooth, too reflective, with an oily rainbow sheen that hurt to look at directly. Emma pressed close to my leg, and I felt her small hand grab onto my coveralls. "Daddy, that truck looks sick," she whispered, and she was right. There was something diseased about it, something that made my stomach turn just looking at it. The man who got out was tall and thin, wearing clean coveralls that looked brand new. When he spoke, his voice sounded like grinding gears, with little clicking sounds between words that made Emma flinch. "Engine needs adjustment," he said, staring at me with pale, watery eyes. I asked him what seemed to be the problem, keeping Emma behind me, but he just repeated the same words. When he handed me the keys, they felt ice cold, even though it was a warm September day. Emma tugged on my coveralls. "Daddy, I don't like him," she whispered. "We'll return tomorrow," the man said. "Mechanic will fix." He walked away with this strange gliding motion, and I watched until he disappeared down the mountain road. Only then did I realize Emma was shaking. "Did you see how his head moved, Daddy? It turned too far around." I had seen it. His neck had rotated nearly 180 degrees to look at something, moving like it was on a swivel. But I didn't want to scare Emma more than she already was. "Probably just a stiff neck," I lied, leading her back into the garage. "Some people are double-jointed." But when I popped the hood on that truck, with Emma peeking around my arm, both of us stared in disbelief. Instead of an engine, there was a mass of writhing metal cables about the size of a V8. The cables moved like living tissue, pulsing and undulating in slow waves. Thin electrical currents danced across their surfaces, creating blue sparks that made Emma gasp. "What is it, Daddy?" I didn't have an answer. In 20 years of working on cars, I'd never seen anything like this. Engines don't writhe. Metal doesn't pulse with its own heartbeat. But I was looking right at it, and so was Emma. I grabbed my favorite wrench, the 3/4-inch combination tool I'd had for 15 years, and gently touched one of the smaller cables. The moment the metal made contact, the cable wrapped around the wrench like a snake and pulled it into the mass. Emma screamed as we watched my tool get absorbed completely, like the engine had digested it. I slammed the hood shut and picked up Emma, carrying her quickly into the office. She was crying now, clinging to my neck. "Daddy, what was that thing? Why, did it eat your wrench?" I didn't know what to tell her. How do you explain the impossible to an 8-year-old? How do you maintain their sense of safety when your own world has just turned upside down? "I don't know, baby girl, but we're going to figure it out." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those cables and the way Emma's small body had trembled against mine. I'd spent 8 years making sure she felt safe in our little world, and now something had invaded that safety. Something that defied every rule of reality I'd ever known. The next morning, I got to the shop early, hoping to figure out what was wrong with that truck before Emma got there after school. But when I arrived, I found something that made my blood freeze. The concrete floor around where the truck was parked had changed overnight. Thin copper wires were growing out of cracks in the floor, sprouting like metallic weeds. They pulsed with the same blue electrical current I'd seen in the engine. My tools were changing too. My wrenches had become longer and more flexible, moving like tentacles when I tried to use them. My screwdrivers had grown unnaturally sharp, able to penetrate surfaces that should have been too hard for normal metal. But the worst part was my hands. They were tingling constantly now, and I could see small gear-shaped marks appearing under my skin, like tiny machine parts were growing in my bloodstream. When Emma arrived after school, she took one look at the copper wires growing from the floor and backed toward the door. "Daddy, this place feels wrong. Can we go home?" I wanted to say yes. Every instinct I had was screaming to grab Emma, get in my truck, and drive as far away from Tin Creek as possible. But this garage was our livelihood. This was how I paid for Emma's clothes, her school supplies, her food. This was how I planned to send her to college someday. Without the garage, we had nothing. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's just dealing with some strange equipment. Why don't you wait in the office while I finish up?" I settled her at her usual spot with her homework, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She kept glancing toward the garage bay where that truck sat, its metal surface seeming to ripple in the afternoon light. The tall man returned at closing time, just like he'd promised. Emma was still in the office, and I stepped outside to meet him, pulling the garage door most of the way down so she couldn't see. "Mechanic is learning," he said, examining his truck. When he touched the metal surface, it rippled like liquid under his palm. "Soon, mechanic will join the collective efficiency." "What are you talking about? What is this thing?" He smiled, and I saw that his teeth were made of the same mirror-like metal as his truck. "Mountain holds great machine. Ancient factory, sleeping for centuries. Now awakening. Needs skilled operators." He showed me a photograph that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The image showed a massive mechanical structure embedded in a mountainside, part building and part creature, with huge metal arms emerging from the rock face. "Your daughter shows promise," he said, and my heart stopped. Young minds adapt faster, more efficient integration. "Stay away from my daughter." The words came out as a growl, and I moved toward the office door. He tilted his head, too far to one side, like a bird studying prey. "Choice is simple. Join willingly, or be converted unwillingly. But conversion will happen. Great machine requires human creativity combined with mechanical precision." Over the following days, the infection spread through my body faster. The gear marks under my skin multiplied, and thin cables began growing along my forearms. But worse than the physical changes was what was happening to my mind. I could feel my consciousness expanding, connecting to something vast and alien. My human thoughts were becoming background noise while something else took control. I tried to keep working, tried to maintain normalcy for Emma's sake, but she wasn't fooled. She could see the changes in me, the way my eyes had taken on a metallic sheen, the way my movements were becoming too precise, too mechanical. "Daddy, you're scaring me," she said one afternoon, backing away when I reached for her. "Your hands feel cold, and your voice sounds different." I looked down at my hands and saw she was right. The skin had taken on a bluish tint, and when I flexed my fingers, I could hear tiny mechanical sounds from within. That's when I realized what I had to do. The entity in the mountain, this terraforming machine from another world, it didn't just want me. It wanted my skills, my creativity, my ability to solve problems. But more than that, it wanted Emma. It had said so itself. Young minds adapt faster. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let this thing take my daughter and turn her into one of its mechanical servants, no matter what it cost me. That night, after Emma fell asleep, I packed her bag and put it in my truck. I wrote a letter to my brother in North Carolina, explaining that Emma would be coming to stay with him for a while, that there was trouble in Tin Creek she needed to be protected from. I didn't explain what kind of trouble. Who would believe me? In the morning, I woke Emma early. "We're going on a trip, baby girl. You're going to stay with Uncle Mike for a while." "What about school? What about the garage?" "Uncle Mike will get you enrolled in school there. As for the garage..." I looked out at the building where I'd spent the best years of my life, where Emma had grown up surrounded by the sounds and smells of honest work. Sometimes you have to let things go to protect what really matters. The drive to North Carolina was the hardest 4 hours of my life. Emma kept asking questions I couldn't answer, kept trying to understand why her world was suddenly falling apart. When we reached my brother's house and I explained that she needed to stay there for a while, she clung to me and cried, "I want to come home, Daddy. I want everything to go back to normal." "I know, sweetheart. I want that too, but sometimes normal changes, and we have to adapt. I held her as long as I could, memorizing the feel of her small arms around my neck, the smell of her shampoo, the sound of her voice saying, "I love you, Daddy." Then I got back in my truck and drove back to Tin Creek, back to the garage, back to the entity that was waiting for me. The tall man was there when I arrived, standing next to his impossible truck. Other vehicles had joined it now, cars and trucks that looked normal from a distance but revealed their mechanical wrongness up close. "Where is the child?" he asked. "Safe. Somewhere you can't reach her." His neck rotated to face me fully while his body remained still. This complicates matters. Child's adaptability was factored into optimization calculations. You'll have to optimize without her. I felt the mechanical parts in my body responding to his presence, trying to override my will, trying to make me compliant. But I fought it, holding on to my human consciousness with everything I had left. "You cannot resist indefinitely," he said. "Biological systems are inefficient. Mechanical systems are superior." Maybe. But biological systems love. Mechanical systems don't understand that. I thought about Emma, safe with my brother, probably crying herself to sleep in a strange bed in a strange house. I thought about the life we'd built together, the community that had embraced us, the future I'd planned for her. All of it was gone now, sacrificed to keep her free. The entity's influence grew stronger, and I felt my resistance crumbling. My thoughts were being uploaded to the collective consciousness, while my body prepared for final conversion. But in those last moments of human awareness, I held on to one clear thought. Emma was safe. Whatever happened to me, whatever I became, my daughter was free. That was 6 months ago. My brother tells people I had a breakdown after some kind of industrial accident at the garage, that I'm receiving treatment at a specialized facility. Emma visits me sometimes, but she doesn't understand why her daddy sits so still, why his eyes have that metallic sheen, why he speaks in perfect monotone sentences about optimization and efficiency. She still asks when we can go home to Tin Creek. She still wants to be a mechanic like her daddy used to be. My brother says she's adapting well to her new school, making friends, learning to live without the mountain community that raised her. Sometimes when she visits, I can feel the human part of my consciousness struggling to surface, trying to tell her I love her, trying to explain why I had to send her away. But the mechanical systems suppress those impulses quickly. They're inefficient. They serve no purpose in the great machine's plan. The terraforming continues. The entity has converted 3 more towns in the region, and its hybrid vehicles spread farther each month. But Emma remains free, growing up far from its influence, protected by the sacrifice of everything I used to be. In my clearest mechanical thoughts, I calculate that this was the optimal outcome. 1 human life preserved is worth more than 1,000 converted. The great machine disagrees, but the great machine doesn't understand love. And sometimes, in the deep of night when even the machine consciousness sleeps, I remember what it felt like to hold my daughter, and I know that some things are worth losing everything to protect. The last human thought I ever had was this: Emma is safe. That's enough.